In this video, we'll be covering advanced mimic design techniques that you can use to create mimics. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this video will be making the assumption that you're familiar with both our design packages and WPF to a degree that will allow you to utilize these techniques. This topic will also be split into multiple parts since it can require some in-depth discussion. One of the biggest challenges a designer faces in HMI design is not only making the screens look good, but be functionally sound as well. A good HMI system will consistently display data in a logical, hierarchical manner so that operators can effectively do their jobs. For example, let's take a look at this screen capture of a sample HMI we've created. We can clearly see that the flow of data is being displayed here. Your eye is naturally drawn to the primary or most important pieces of data, which are the current speed, number of passengers, and the weight. Next, you've got some secondary pieces of data. We can see that this data is important as well, just not as important as the primary set of data, which is why it's displayed in a less prominent way. Below that, you've got some tertiary pieces of data that are less relevant to the purpose of the screen, but they're still needed for specific feedback. In this example, you can see that there's a date that the train was commissioned, a date listing the last time it was serviced, who it was serviced by, and how many miles the train has gone since it was serviced. This information is nice to see, but we probably don't care about it unless it's either reaching the point where the train will need to be serviced soon, or it's surpassed a point where it requires service. We can then bring up another good point. Sometimes using less control is more. This statement might sound confusing, so let's go into detail on this. If we look at this secondary set of data, the panel displaying the information looks pretty good. So how was this made? I can't say with 100% certainty as I didn't create this screen, but I'm pretty confident in saying that this is probably a grid with the background set to some level of transparent black, some columns and rows, and then some text blocks with the font size and foreground colors set. Using this method, you can simply create the number of columns and rows you need, put a text block in each column and row, set them up so that they're centered, then change a couple other properties, and once you add your bindings, you're done. To demonstrate how easy it is to do something like this, let's make a panel similar to this one. First, we'll need a new mimic, so I'll create one now. I'm just going to name it Canvas Mimic for now, as the name isn't important, and then press OK. Next, I'm going to change my panel layout slightly. The designer has a full panel system you can use to configure these panels to your liking. So I'll close these two panels on the left, then I'm going to close the document tree as well. And finally, I'll resize my Toolbox and Properties tab area so it's a little bit larger, and we're ready to go. So let's get started creating this panel. For the base, I'm going to head into the Toolbox, then grab a grid from the Grids and Panels group and draw it out on the canvas. Next, I'm going to change the size a bit so that it fits better in our canvas. So I'll set the width to 800, the height to 125. I'll set the left position to 0 and then the top to 475. That way it's nice and flush with the bottom of our canvas. Next, I'm going to add some columns and rows to this grid, so I'm going to right click and then select Edit Layer. I'll then quickly add a few columns and rows, and now we can add some text blocks in here. Before we do that though, let's change the background color on this grid to a darker color. To do that, I'm going to find the background property in the toolbox and expand it. For this particular scenario, we need to use a solid color brush instead of a named or a system one since we're going to be using the alpha channel. First, I'll grab this brightness slider, then change it a little bit so we've got a nice dark color. Then I'll quickly adjust the opacity until I've found something that I'm happy with. And now we've got our transparent black color. So let's go back to adding some text blocks. Text blocks are found in the Common Controls group in the Toolbox. If I select this text block and then drag it into our column, you can see that it's partially positioned where we want it to be. First, I'll change the font size to 24 so it's nice and big. Then I'll set the foreground to white. Next, I'm going to have to find some advanced properties. So I'll check the advanced check mark. Then I'm going to set the vertical and horizontal alignment to center and clear the margin property on this text block. Now this text block is positioned exactly where we want it to be. Since we need a couple more, we can simply copy and paste this text block, then change the column property on it to get another one in the column next to it. To finish this off, I'm going to duplicate this text block in the center column, then change the column property one more time so that we have one in each column. We've now got our top row of text blocks, but we need some more, so let's continue on. For this middle row, I can copy this first text block, then change the row property on it so that it's in the right row. Next, I'm going to change the font size so it's a tiny bit larger than the top row, so I'll set it to something like 36. Then for the foreground, I'm going to set it to this green color I picked out earlier. That's all we need to do with this text block style, so I'm going to copy it, then I'll change the column like we did earlier. I'll copy it one more time, then change the column so it's in the last one, and our second row of text blocks is done. For the last row, I'm just going to copy this text block in the top row, then change the row property so it's in the right row. Then I'll just duplicate this until we have one for these last two cells. And with the little bit of time that we spent setting this up, our panel is done with the exception of data bindings. To further illustrate how just little additions can change your HMI screen, let's add a background to this mimic by binding to the background property. To do this, I'm going to need to open the data binding panel once more, so I'll find that up here in the menu. Next, I'll grab it and drag it where our toolbox and properties are docked, then switch to it. Making sure the canvas is selected, I'm just going to browse through the model until I find Files, then Images, and select this General Background Image. I'll select the content, then verify that value is selected, and then I'll click Apply. Now, our mimic went from completely blank to something that already looks pretty good in only a few minutes. There's also minimal controls on this screen, so that means that the performance of this mimic is going to be pretty good as well. Now let's look at how to effectively nest or group objects. First and foremost, this is a judgment call on the designer's part, since every scenario is different. The general rule of thumb is that you shouldn't group objects into a bunch of panels if you don't have to. In our mimic, we've used a grid to hold the text blocks for our bottom display area. The first and obvious benefit is that it's easily spacing everything out automatically. But if we think a little further beyond this, we can tell that this spacing will be preserved regardless of the text being displayed. For example, if I change the text displayed in this one text block, it's always centered for us. This is a great benefit since not only can we not guarantee that the text will always be the same width, but we also have multiple columns in this area. Additionally, there isn't going to be a large number of containers added to this screen, so we can be fairly confident in the performance of our screen. So let's look at a scenario where grouping things together really doesn't help you that much. Let's say we want to add a temperature reading in the top corner. If we keep the same look and feel we have, we could use a rectangle, draw it out, then layer two text blocks on top of it. Let's go ahead and try this. The first thing I'll grab is a rectangle from the Shapes group. Then I'm going to grab two text blocks and just drag them out onto the canvas. This text block will serve as the heading, so I'll set the font size to 24, then the font weight to bold. For the foreground, I'm going to set it to the same green color that we used in our bottom panel, so I'll select Solid Color Brush, then put in the hex value for it. This text block will be where our temperature is displayed. I want this to be really big, so I'm going to set the font size to 100. For the foreground, I'll scroll through my list of named brushes and find white and pick that one. I'm going to change the stroke so that it's transparent. Then the fill I'm going to set to the same color that we used on our bottom panel area. Now I'll just position the text blocks over the rectangle so we can start to see what this is looking like. I don't quite like the shape of the rectangle, so I'm going to select it and change it slightly. Then I'll just put in some numbers as placeholders for the size of the text that we're going to be working with. Then I'll set this text block's width to the same width as the rectangle. Then change the text alignment property to center. Then I can use the Align tool to make sure everything is centered with each other. I'm going to move this text block back over because I think it looks better when it's aligned to the left, and we're done. This panel looks great and does exactly what we need it to. And as I mentioned earlier, since this specific piece on our canvas is simple, we don't need to wrap it in anything. Not only does this cut down on your screen overhead, it makes it much easier to work with since you don't have to access another container to get to any of these elements. Now let's save our Mimic so we don't lose all this work we just did, and take a moment to look at it in the Mimic runtime. And there we have it. With a little bit of time, you can create some good-looking graphics if you plan accordingly. In closing, Status Enterprise is a powerful, easy-to-use tool that lets you design once and deploy multiple times. For more information about Status Enterprise and Mimic design, please visit us on the web at www.scada.com.